Hello, so today's video is all about the Canon 70-200 2.8. Now this is the image stabilized version, but the Mark I version of this lens, and I've had it for about 15 years. I've used it all over the world on all kinds of different assignments, and in today's video I'm just going to talk about some of my experiences of using it, talk about some of the history behind this particular focal length, talk about some of the good things about it, some of the bad things about it. But to begin with, I'll just show you a few of the examples of some of the pictures that I've taken with it over the years, just so you can get an idea of what this lens is capable of. Here we go. So to begin with, we'll just talk a little bit about history, and prior to this lens I had the non-IS version for about 10 years, and I shot all kinds of different things with that, hard news and travel and features all over the world. That lens took a battering, and I think it was finally an around the world yacht race that finally kind of pretty much forced me into replacing it with this one. But that lens still worked. The original one was great. And it was, it still worked up until the day that I replaced it with this IS version. But prior to that, and we're going back into the early 90s here, we were shooting film, and most photographers were using primarily prime lenses, not zooms, because zoom lenses were pretty rubbish quality at that time, and they didn't have fast maximum apertures, and we needed reasonable aperture lenses to be able to work with the slow ISO nature of film. And it was only when the 70-200 zoom lens and the other lenses in the sort of holy trinity arrived that most photographers started to adopt having zoom lenses with the EOS camera. So it was the EOS 1 and the 70-200 or 80-200 was the first one. That they became part of every professional photographer's armoury. And the reason for that was that it enabled us to work. You could work under, you could photograph things in difficult lighting conditions. And that was the main reason why people adopted it. It was that it enabled us to photograph in tricky lighting circumstances, not for the bokeh or anything like that. And so that stayed true during the early days of digital as well, because the early digital cameras weren't particularly good high ISO. And it's only in recent years, as cameras have now got crazy high ISO capabilities, that really the 70-200 2.8 has almost become a little bit secondary to requirements in many cases. So I personally also shoot with a 70-300L lens, the f4 to 5.6 version, because it's smaller and lighter, pretty much just as sharp, but so much more versatile. And I don't need that 2.8 aperture all the time, so I can crank the ISO up on my cameras. Apart from the times that you absolutely, definitely, 100% need 2.8. And I'll give you an example of, I was out photographing a storm recently, which hit a seaside town near where I live, and it was dark, and there were massive waves crashing over the seafront, and there were 80-mile-an-hour winds blowing, but it was really dark. And I was shooting with this 5D Mark IV at 6400 ISO, and still I could only get a 60th of a second at 2.8. And that was just fast enough to freeze some of the action, and I just managed to get a picture. Whereas if I'd been working with my 70-300 with a 5.6 maximum aperture, I would have been down 2 stops. So I'd have been working at 15th of a second. I couldn't really push the ISO anymore. So this 2.8 lens enabled me to get that picture, and the flexibility of it at that time is extraordinary. It's the right tool for the job under those circumstances. So I suppose I'm quite interested by the fact that I logged onto a photographer's forum the other night, and I was looking through some of the posts, and I was quite interested how many people have these things now. And it sort of started raise the question in my mind of why do lots of photographers seem to want these things? And it is a vital part of the armory for photographers, but only for those that really need to work in really difficult conditions, which isn't everybody by any means. And there are so many more flexible options out there, both in terms of prime lenses and zoom lenses, for people that don't need to work in very difficult circumstances. But the flexibility of this is extraordinary. Okay, so let's just give a little bit of talk about the actual lens in terms of itself. So 70-200mm on a full frame camera, also works on a crop frame sensor. absolutely fine. 2.8 aperture all the way through. Image quality is fine for me. I know a lot of people have talked about the Mark II and the Mark III version of this lens being sharper, and I'm sure that that may or may not be the case, but I personally have not had any issues at all with image quality with this lens. And I think I just got a good version. Maybe that could be partly due. I've spoken before about how I think that the Canon quality control of some of their lens ranges was a bit off, and maybe there were good versions and bad versions of some particular lenses, and I think that might be the case. And I think on this occasion I've been lucky and had a good one, because this lens has been sharp on all of my cameras over the years, no problem at all. There is a slight issue when shooting wide open, that you can end up with slightly out of focus pictures, and it's always difficult to nail that down, because, you know, shooting at 2.8 on a 200mm lens, especially if the subject is reasonably close, like a portrait for example, you've got a very fine slither of depth of field, and so you know, it's very easy to say, oh, it's the lens's fault, when actually maybe you've got a bit of subject movement or a little bit of technique error in terms of your focusing skills. And you know, I find that if I'm shooting this lens at 2.8, I need to take extra care to make sure that it is sharp, extra care. And typically I will also shoot, if I can, I'll stop down a little bit. So under most circumstances, I wouldn't shoot with this lens wide open. I would shoot maybe at f4, at 3.5, and that you know, I feel a little bit more confident about absolutely sharp frames. But if I need to shoot at 2.8, I will, and the bokeh at 2.8 is amazing. You can throw the background out of focus and get a really nice pop to the background, but it just requires a little bit of extra care. Now, whether that's the same case with the Mark II or the Mark III, I don't know. I'd be interested to hear anyone else's thoughts that's shot with both of those lenses. I never felt the need to upgrade because this has done pretty much what I wanted it to do over the years. And if I'm completely honest, I've been waiting for it to break. It's so battered, you know, it's been done so many different things. I've been waiting for it to break to replace it with probably the Mark III, but it just continues to work, so I've continued to use it. Simple as that. It's an interesting thought that people with R cameras with the RF mount might be looking at this lens now, because it is a cost-effective solution. In fact, looking on the second-hand market, these things are this particular version is probably one of the cheapest that there are at the moment. Even the non-IS versions still attract a reasonable price, but you can pick these things up for about £600, and that's cheaper than the Mark II and Mark III, and certainly a lot cheaper than the RF 70 to 200 2.8. And so this might be of interest to people using the R cameras with the adapter, and I tried it on the R5 and it works absolutely perfectly fine, although it is quite big and heavy, because it just, with the adapter, it throws it out a little bit further from the camera body. And with these big old lenses, you do find that you need or I certainly find with big hands, that you need the grip on the camera to kind of balance it all out properly. Okay, so let's talk about what's bad about this lens. Well, it's big and it's heavy and it's expensive, even though it's kind of the cheapest of the 70 to 200s that you might find. It is a very kind of loud lens, let's put it that way, that not in terms of the focus noise, because it's actually quite quiet, but in terms of the attention that it draws, let's put it that way, that it shouts, "Photographer!" And that can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on what it is that you're trying to do. And I think that in so many ways, this is overkill for so many people out there. I think that unless you're really needing to take pictures that are in really difficult light circumstances where you absolutely have to deliver a picture for a client, or you really want the ultimate in bokeh of being able to throw the background out of focus at 2.8, I think there are lots of other options out there that are a bit more cheaper and flexible for most photographers, if I'm completely honest. What else is bad about it? Well, this particular lens gets nose wobble. I call it nose wobble, which is where this bit on the end comes loose. You can fix it because you can peel this focus ring back, and you can just tighten it up with screwdrivers and tighten the screws up and put a bit of lock thread stuff in there, glue, but be careful with that. Also, I'm not sure whether these things still are serviced or not by Canon, or you know, any of the other camera companies. I think some of this older gear is now reaching a point where you need to check, if you're looking to invest, you need to check that they can still service it and can still repair it. Okay, so what's good about it? Well, the build quality has to be mentioned, that this thing is a tank. This particular lens has been through all kinds of different trauma, and yet it still works perfectly well. The layout of it is just awesome. The zoom ring just falls exactly where you want it to. The focus ring is nice and smooth if you want to use manual focus. The controls on the side of it are pretty straightforward. There's nothing too complicated. The image stabilization might not be the best in the world, but it works really well, really reliably. The reliability of this thing and the fact that it just does so much heavy lifting in the real world of professional photography just means that it's, for me, it's just an awesome piece of equipment, and I wouldn't be without it, even though I don't necessarily use it that often anymore. I really hope this has given some kind of perspective to you. If you have an interest in this lens or you've enjoyed watching it, please do comment, subscribe, like, all of those different things. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on this lens and your own personal sort of telephoto lens choice. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.